Good evening. As John said, my name is Rick Horne. I'm a member of Tali TakTaki Lodge 70. And this evening I wanted to share a little bit about the early history of Lodge 70. Now you'll see in my title slide here, it shows Greystone Lodge and Tali TakTaki Lodge 70. And we're going to talk a little bit about how those names came about. In February 1910, the Boy Scouts of America was founded. In July 1915, the first Order of the Arrow induction took place on Treasure Island, a scout camp in the Delaware River near Philadelphia. And 15 years later, Cherokee Lodge 50 was founded in Birmingham, Alabama. There was a professional there at the time named Frank Braden, who was a charter member of that lodge. And in 1933, the Greensboro Council, located in Greensboro, North Carolina, hired Frank Braden to be their scout executive. One of the first things that he did upon arrival was he wrote to Rob Roy Price, who was the Grand Chieftain of the Order of the Arrow, and advised him that he had moved to Greensboro and he was interested in starting a chapter of the Order of the Arrow, and that it had been a good experience in Birmingham, and he was looking forward to bringing it to his new council. Now, this letter was dated April 10th, 1933, and this is the actual original letter that was sent to Mr. Price. We have a carbon copy of the response from Mr. Price. His response was sent just 3 days later saying, we'd love for you to start a chapter. We will send you informational packets and the application and all the things you need to get started. Well, it got to be May 25th, and Frank Braden had not received that information yet. So he was getting a little anxious because camp was going to open on June 7th. So he wrote back and was looking for that information. Now, in the meantime, he put out a newsletter, a bulletin to the scout leaders in his council that the Order of the Arrow, a National Honor Campers Fraternity, was going to be installed at summer camp that summer. Mr. Braden brought to his staff at Camp Greystone, and let me note that Greystone spelled Graystone. In 1933, he brought Stanley Mate and Eugene Broyles from Alabama. Now, they were already members of the Order of the Arrow, and these three OA brothers conducted the first ceremonies of the Order of the Arrow in North Carolina. Here's a listing of local lodges that's dated June 20th, 1933. And if you look down toward the bottom, you'll see Frank Braden's name listed in Greensboro, North Carolina, but there's no lodge name or lodge totem. In August, I guess following most of the camp season, they did send in their application to start an Order of the Arrow lodge. It mentions Camp Greystone as the location, but where it asks for an Indian name for the lodge and for the totem, those lines were left blank. Now, there was a letter that accompanied this, and down here in the second paragraph of Mr. Braden's letter, he says that the lodge has not yet chosen a name or a totem for the lodge, and but things were off to a good start. Now, something I want to point out, and hopefully you can see, I've got some pictures sort of in the way, but in the upper right-hand corner is the number 58 is on this piece of paper. Just want to point that out. The next piece of information we have is a 1934 dues invoice from the Grand Lodge, dated June 13th, 1934, to Frank Braden, and it says Greystone Lodge. And it also says over here on the right, file number 58. I think I've read and understand that the members of the lodge wanted to call it Greystone Lodge, but they didn't want to just call it Greystone Lodge. They wanted an Indian name for Greystone Lodge. But apparently that word got to the people at the Grand Lodge, and so they decided to call it Greystone Lodge. But if you notice the spelling, it's Greystone. Now, nobody from Greensboro would have spelled it this way because the camp's name was spelled with an A. So this makes us think that this name may have been assigned by somebody at the national level rather than being chosen at that time by the local airmen. Now, on the back of that piece of paper, you'll notice it says, send charter to Greystone Lodge number 58 for year ending December 31st, 1934. And it shows Frank Braden, who's the scout executive in Greensboro. So at this point, if you look at any national publications, there's no lodge numbers assigned, but apparently there were files, and these files were numbered, and so somehow Greystone Lodge was considered number 58 at that time. 1934, this is a brochure for summer camp, and in this brochure, it talks about the Order of the Arrow having been installed, and that would be part of the program. We next have a listing of active lodges, and now the first one I showed you actually had lodges listed in order by the city they were located in. This one is more in a traditional lineup, I'd say more in the order in which lodges were installed or initiated. Now, down here, you'll see it shows Greystone Lodge, Frank W. Braden, Greensboro, NC. This was on page 3 of the listing. So this is in November of 34. Now, just 2 months later, we have a due statement from January of 1935, and it says at the top, Greystone Lodge number 70. So somewhere between November of 34 and January 22nd of 35, apparently lodge numbers got assigned. There's been a story, I guess I've heard this story since I started patch trading 50 years ago, or however long it was. The Over the Arrow members in Greensboro decided to write a letter to Daniel Carter Beard, who was the BSA National Commissioner, and asked for his assistance. He was known as having great knowledge of Indian ways, and they thought they'd ask him for a name that might mean Greystone or Blue Heron Greystone. And while we don't have any correspondence back from him, the story's always been that he wrote back that Tali TakTaki meant blue heron or a heron on a gray stone. So the lodge chose that name, and we next see that September 4th, 1936, on a listing of Over the Arrow lodges from the National Bulletin. Down here it shows Tali TakTaki, 70, Greensboro, North Carolina, and it now shows A.F. Dix, who was a new scout executive that came in during this time period. The lodge had some very dynamic people in it and some people that were very motivated. In the summer of 1936, J. Rucker Newberry, who was the scout executive in Augusta, Georgia, asked that the degree team from Tali TakTaki come and install his new lodge, which became Bob White Lodge 87. Bob Wolf, who was one of these dedicated people, had attended school at the University of Pennsylvania, and in 1936, he attended the National Lodge meeting, which was held at Treasure Island. He is reportedly the first person from Region 6, which would have been North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, to attend one of those meetings. In 1937, the Lodge degree team installed Occoneechee Lodge 104. Now, 1938 was a very busy year for the lodge as we look through their history. In April, Joseph Brenton, who was the national chief of the Over the Arrow, visited the lodge's annual meeting at Camp Greystone. There were other people there from other councils, some people from East Carolina Council and from Winston-Salem. And as a result of this meeting and their discussions, Tali's degree team helped install Croatan Lodge 117 and Wahissa Lodge 118 that summer. Now in September, and you may not have known, but the National Lodge meeting seemed to be held during Labor Day weekend. But September 3rd to the 5th, a delegation of 6 brothers from Tali TakTaki Lodge went to Irondale Scout Reservation for the National Lodge meeting. Now we have a photo here, and I want to point out some of the people in this photo because they're significant to the history of the lodge. But on the left is Frank Dix, the scout executive currently. The next person is Lloyd Nelson, who at the time was national scribe, a later national chief. In the middle is Frank Braden, who was the founder of the lodge. Then we have Joseph Brenton, who was the national chief, I believe, at the time. And the other gentleman standing is Bob Wolf. The 4 people kneeling in the front are scouts from the council, and the one second from the right is George Gibbs, who was the 1938 lodge chief. In 1939, the lodge helped install a new lodge, Sloggy Lodge, in Cherokee Council, which was a neighboring council to the Greensboro Council. In 1940, Tali TakTaki Lodge sent 14 members to Camp Twin Echo for the National Lodge meeting. Now, at this time, Tali TakTaki was really taking some leadership roles and provided several people that were involved with training as well as serving on some committees. And at this event, Frank Dix, the scout executive, was elected to the OA's National Executive Committee. April 1941, there was an appreciation dinner held in Greensboro, and Ian R. Goodman was the speaker there. Shortly thereafter, in May 1941, the OA's National Bulletin announced that the National Executive Committee had accepted the invitation from Tali TakTaki Lodge and Frank Dix to hold the 1942 National Lodge meeting at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. So this was the first meeting, I believe, to be planned for a college campus. Also happening during the rest of 1941, Tali TakTaki Lodge helped start Uwharrie Lodge 208 in neighboring High Point. In the fall, there was an event called the Carolina Jubilee, which was held at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. There had been one of these events held in 1935, one in 1938, and this one in 1941. And there were a number of national leaders of the Over the Arrow attended this event. And the OA National Executive Committee met in Chapel Hill along with this event in order to plan for the upcoming national meeting. Unfortunately, if you know your history, in December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And due to travel restrictions, when we entered the World War II, the national meeting was canceled. However, the people in the national organization encouraged local OA lodges to get together. And so Tali TakTaki actually hosted an event. They invited other airmen from across North Carolina to come to Camp Greystone for a weekend of fellowship, and much like one of our conclaves today. And reportedly there were about 70 airmen attended that event. Now during the war, I'd say most lodges or scouting was local. People were involved with providing service locally. There wasn't a lot of travel going on. This is a picture of a number of scouts in Greensboro that were, I'm sure, helping distribute posters about buying savings bonds. And if you notice, there's a scout, a blonde scout toward the right middle that's wearing a patch that I believe is a Tali felt. And this would have been probably 1943, 44, somewhere along there maybe. During the war, Bob Wolf became an assistant scout executive in Greensboro. And in 1945, he was hired by Tuscarora Council headquartered in Goldsboro, North Carolina, to be their scout executive. And one of his first priorities was to install an OA lodge, which became Narn Lodge 296. Another thing that Bob Wolf did was really help promote an upcoming, the first Area I North Carolina OA Fellowship meeting, which was held at Camp Greystone. The people that went to that event received a leather neckerchief slide that's pictured here. We have a copy of the program, and similar to events today, we had, there was time for training, discussions, meals were served, there were games played. It looked like it was a good event that they held at the camp. In 1946, Tali TakTaki Lodge helped Cape Fear Council start its OA Lodge, which was Clahican number 331. Now, in 1946, the Arrow resumed having national meetings, and they wanted to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where they had planned to go in 1942. I don't want to get into the politics too much, but there was some concerns about housing. This was a segregated South, and some people from other areas of the country that might have been of different races may not have been welcome at the university. And there were also many military people returning, so we'll just call it housing issues of the university prevented them from hosting the event in 1946. The meeting was moved to Chenille Field in Illinois, and Tali TakTaki Lodge sent 24 brothers to that event. Now, their former member, Bob Wolf, was recognized during that event for the Distinguished Service Award. And I believe he declined to accept it at that time because he was a professional. And I think he felt at that point that it was an award more for volunteers. But he was being recognized, though, for all that he had done to contribute to the success of the Order of the Arrow. Following the war, a lot of other lodges stepped up and grew and took leadership roles in the state. And so the prominence of Tali TakTaki Lodge kind of, I'll call it, went down or didn't increase during that time period. But there were successful events. We had fellowship meetings at Morrow Mountain State Park in 46 and 47. But I want to take just a moment. I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about patches, but there's always an interest in this group about patches. And I wanted to share a few early items here. Probably the most controversial one is the first item here, which is a chenille. The chenille was found by Wayne Farrar of the Hammerstone Scout Museum, and he got it from George Gibbs. And if you recall, I mentioned George Gibbs was one of those kneeling scouts that went to the 1938 national meeting. He claimed that this was a sweater monogram patch that he received, and Wayne seemed to think it was issued before the 37 Jamboree. The next patch, located in the middle there, was, we think, issued in the late 30s. It's a twill patch, and it's Julius Hayworth, who was a former lodge chief, was interviewed in the 1970s, and he said when this patch showed up, everybody said, "That looks like a duck." They weren't real happy. It didn't look like a blue heron to them. So it's kind of got the nickname as the duck patch. I don't think I only know of one, but I'm sure there are others that out there somewhere. But it's a fairly rare patch. The third patch on the top row was made on felt, navy blue felt. And that patch was used, I think, for several years, probably maybe the late 30s through World War II, I think was probably when that patch was out there. And I really think there were probably a couple hundred of those patches issued. I've seen numerous photographs of Eagle Scouts, and they actually sewed this patch on the top of their merit badge sash. We see some scouts wearing them in pictures. I just think there were a lot of them, even though you don't find that many around these days. Across the bottom row are variations on that design. They're all twill and were used up through, into the 50s. In 1957, Lodge Chief Steve Glass designed the first flap, the S1. That design basically was used for the next 20 years, and some similar to that was used up until the lodge merged with URA Lodge in 1991. So that concludes my discussion of the early years of Tali TakTaki Lodge.